The moment Tracy Reiner heard those words from Nick, everything she thought she knew about her family shattered into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't just a confession. It was a revelation that would change the course of her entire life. And as she stood there, processing what he had just told her, a chilling realization crept up her spine. If Nick had done this to their parents, what was stopping him from doing the same to her? This is the story of secrets buried deep within a family, of trust betrayed in the most unimaginable way, and of one woman's journey to uncover the truth before it was too late. Tracy Reiner never imagined she'd be sitting across from her brother Nick, listening to him explain why he orchestrated the most devastating event in their family's history. Growing up, they had been close, not just siblings, but best friends who shared everything. Their parents had built a comfortable life for them, filled with summer vacations, family dinners, and the kind of stability most people only dream about. But beneath that picture-perfect surface, something dark had been brewing, something Tracy never saw coming until it was almost too late. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every way except for what was about to unfold. Tracy had driven to Nick's apartment after receiving a cryptic text message that simply read, "We need to talk about Mom and Dad. Come alone." The urgency in those words sent ice through her veins. Their parents had passed away 3 years earlier in what everyone believed was a tragic accident, a house fire that investigators ruled as faulty wiring. The community mourned, friends offered condolences, and life eventually moved forward as it always does after tragedy strikes. But Nick's message suggested that everything they had been told was a lie. When Tracy arrived at Nick's place, she found him different than she remembered. He had always been the charming one, the sibling who could talk his way out of any situation, who made friends effortlessly and seemed to glide through life without the struggles that plagued others. But the man who opened the door that evening looked haunted. His eyes carried shadows that hadn't been there before, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured for her to come inside. The apartment was sparse, almost sterile, as if he had been preparing to leave at a moment's notice. Papers were stacked in neat piles, and a single suitcase sat by the door, half-packed, waiting. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before Nick finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if saying the words too loudly would make them more real than he could bear. He told Tracy that the fire wasn't an accident. He told her that he had been involved. And then, in excruciating detail, he explained why he had done it. The reasons were complex, layered with years of resentment, financial desperation, and a twisted logic that only made sense in the darkest corners of a desperate mind. Their parents, he claimed, had been planning to cut him out of their will entirely after discovering his gambling debts. Debts that had spiraled so far out of control that dangerous people were making threats against his life. Tracy sat frozen, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. This was her brother, the person she had trusted more than anyone else in the world, confessing to something so horrific that it seemed impossible. But as he continued talking, providing details that only someone involved would know, the timing of the fire, the specific points of origin, the way he had disabled the smoke detectors days before, she realized with growing horror that he was telling the truth. Nick had orchestrated their parents' deaths to collect the insurance money and pay off his debts before his creditors could make good on their threats. But the confession didn't end there. As Nick spoke, Tracy began to understand another terrifying implication. She had been in danger too. Nick revealed that his original plan had been more extensive, involving a scenario where the entire family would have been in the house that night. It was only a last-minute change in Tracy's plans, a decision to stay late at work that evening, that had saved her life. She had always thought it was luck, even thanked the universe for the demanding project that had kept her at the office. Now she understood it had been the thin line between life and death. Nick admitted that he had struggled with whether to warn her, whether to somehow ensure she wouldn't be home, but in the end, his desperation had almost outweighed his love for his sister. The revelation sent Tracy's mind spinning back through the past 3 years, re-examining every interaction, every conversation, every moment of grief they had supposedly shared. Had it all been a performance? When Nick had cried at the funeral, had those tears been real or carefully calculated? When he had held her hand during the reading of the will, had he been comforting her or simply playing a role? The psychological weight of these questions pressed down on her with crushing force. She had mourned alongside someone who was responsible for the very tragedy they were supposedly mourning together. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Nick explained that he had been living with the guilt ever since. The insurance money had come through, and he had paid off his debts, but instead of relief, he found himself drowning in remorse. The dangerous people who had been threatening him were satisfied and had moved on to other victims. But Nick couldn't move on from what he had done. He had developed insomnia, plagued by nightmares where his parents begged him to stop, where Tracy discovered the truth and looked at him with the same horror that was now in her eyes. He had sought therapy, but how could he confess to a therapist without facing criminal charges? So he had suffered alone, the secret eating him alive from the inside out. Tracy's initial shock began to transform into a complex mixture of emotions: grief, anger, disbelief, and somewhere deep down, a remnant of the love she had always felt for her brother. This internal conflict tore at her as she tried to process everything. Part of her wanted to run from the apartment and never look back, to call the police immediately and ensure that Nick faced justice for what he had done. But another part of her, the part that remembered the little boy who had protected her from bullies in elementary school, who had taught her to ride a bike, who had been her closest ally through their parents' occasional arguments and the typical struggles of family life. That part hesitated. Nick must have seen the conflict in her eyes because he quickly continued, explaining why he had chosen to tell her now. He said he couldn't live with the secret anymore, that it was destroying him piece by piece, and that she deserved to know the truth. But there was another reason too, one that sent another chill through Tracy's body. Nick revealed that some of his former gambling associates had recently resurfaced, asking questions about how he had suddenly come into money 3 years ago. These weren't people bound by legal niceties or concerned with ethical behavior. They were criminals who had their own suspicions about the convenient timing of the insurance payout, and they were starting to connect dots that could put both Nick and Tracy in danger. This was why Nick had insisted she come alone. He believed that if these people suspected he had shared information with anyone, especially family, they might target Tracy to keep her quiet or to use her as leverage against Nick. The paranoia in his voice was palpable as he described being followed, noticing the same car parked outside his apartment on multiple occasions, receiving hang-up calls in the middle of the night. Whether these fears were founded in reality or were manifestations of his guilt-ridden mind was unclear, but the possibility was terrifying enough. Tracy realized that Nick's confession had placed her in an impossible position. She now carried knowledge that made her both a potential witness and a potential target. As the evening wore on and Nick continued his confession, Tracy learned details about their parents' final moments that would haunt her forever. Nick had ensured the fire would start in the middle of the night when they would be sleeping deeply. He had researched how smoke inhalation would cause unconsciousness before the flames reached them, trying to convince himself that they wouldn't suffer. But the investigators' reports, which Nick had obsessively read afterward, suggested otherwise. There had been evidence that their father had woken up and tried to reach the bedroom door. That detail, Nick said with tears streaming down his face, was the one that tormented him most. The image of their father, disoriented and terrified, trying desperately to reach their mother or find a way out, only to be overcome by smoke and flames. It was unbearable. Tracy found herself grappling with an ethical dilemma of staggering proportions. If she went to the police with Nick's confession, she would be ensuring justice for her parents. But she would also be sending her only remaining family member to prison for the rest of his life. If she stayed silent, she would be complicit in covering up their murders, betraying her parents' memory, and potentially allowing Nick to escape consequences for his actions. And looming over both options was the threat of the dangerous people Nick claimed were circling back into his life. Going to the authorities might expose them both to retaliation from criminals who operated outside the law's protection. The complexity of Tracy's situation extended beyond the immediate decision about what to do with Nick's confession. She had to consider the impact on her extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins who had all accepted the official story of the accidental fire. Revealing the truth would shatter their peace and reopen wounds that had slowly been healing over the past 3 years. She thought about her parents' friends, the community members who had donated to a memorial fund in their honor, the neighbors who had brought casseroles and offered support. All of them would feel betrayed by the revelation that they had been mourning under false pretenses. There were also practical considerations that made Tracy's decision even more complicated. Nick had been the executor of their parents' estate, a role he had taken seriously despite his horrific secret. He had settled debts, distributed personal belongings according to their mother's informal wishes, and maintained their parents' home until it sold. The insurance money had been divided between them as the will specified, meaning Tracy herself had benefited financially from the very crime she now knew about. Did that make her complicit in some way? Would she be required to return that money if the truth came out? These questions spiraled through her mind as Nick watched her, waiting for some kind of response. Tracy asked Nick why he thought telling her would somehow alleviate his guilt. Wasn't he just transferring the burden to her shoulders, making her carry the weight of this horrible secret? Nick admitted that yes, he was being selfish even in his confession, that he was seeking some form of absolution that Tracy had no obligation to provide. But he also claimed that he wanted to give her the power to make her own decision about what to do with the information. He said he would accept whatever choice she made, whether that meant turning himself in or continuing to live with the secret. Tracy couldn't help but feel this was manipulative. By framing it as her choice, Nick was attempting to shift responsibility for the outcome onto her shoulders. As the night deepened and their conversation continued, Tracy learned more about Nick's descent into gambling addiction and the circumstances that had led to such desperate measures. He described how it had started innocuously enough: casual poker games with friends, occasional trips to casinos, online betting that seemed harmless. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, it had taken over his life. The thrill of winning had hooked him, and the agony of losing had convinced him that he just needed one more bet, one more game, one more chance to break even. By the time he realized how deep he was in, the debt had become insurmountable. Nick explained that the people he owed money to weren't legitimate lending institutions with legal recourse. They were loan sharks who operated in the shadows, who had no qualms about using violence to collect debts. He described receiving threats that were chillingly specific. They knew where he lived, where he worked, where their parents lived. When he couldn't make payments, the threats escalated. They told him exactly what they would do to him, describing injuries in graphic detail. Some threats extended to his family, suggesting that if Nick couldn't pay, perhaps his parents or sister could. The terror of those threats, Nick claimed, had driven him to consider options he would have never otherwise contemplated. Tracy listened to these explanations with a mixture of sympathy and disgust. Yes, Nick had been in a terrible situation, but millions of people dealt with debt without resorting to murder. There were other options: declaring bankruptcy, seeking legal protection, even going to their parents and admitting the problem. Their parents had been reasonable people. They would have been angry and disappointed, but surely they would have helped find a solution. Nick's insistence that murder had been his only option struck Tracy as a rationalization, a way to avoid taking full responsibility for a choice that had been his alone to make. The gambling debts had created a crisis, but killing their parents had been Nick's response to that crisis, and no amount of external pressure could fully excuse that. The question of premeditation became important as Tracy tried to understand not just what Nick had done, but who he had become. Had this been a snap decision made in a moment of panic, or had he planned it carefully over weeks or months? Nick admitted it had been the latter. He had researched house fires, studied cases where investigations had ruled accidental causes, learned about points of origin and how to mask evidence of arson. He had practiced disabling the smoke detectors in his own apartment to ensure he could do it quickly and quietly in their parents' home. He had chosen a night when he knew their father had taken sleeping medication for his chronic back pain, making it less likely they would wake quickly. Every detail had been calculated, every contingency considered. This wasn't a moment of temporary insanity. It was murder in the first degree, planned and executed with chilling precision. Tracy found herself wondering if she had ever really known her brother at all. The Nick who sat before her, confessing to patricide and matricide, seemed like a complete stranger wearing a familiar face. She thought back to their childhood, searching for warning signs she might have missed, indicators that this darkness had always been lurking beneath the surface. But her memories showed only a normal kid, sometimes selfish, occasionally moody, but nothing that would predict such capability for violence. When had he changed? Or had this potential for extreme action always been there, dormant until circumstances activated it? The psychological trauma of Nick's confession extended beyond the immediate horror of what he had done. Tracy realized she would need to reassess her entire understanding of her family history, her own identity, and her judgment of character. If she couldn't see this in her own brother, someone she had known her entire life, how could she trust her perception of anyone? The betrayal undermined her fundamental sense of security and belonging in the world. She felt adrift, untethered from the reality she had always known, floating in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Nick mentioned that he had written a detailed confession, sealed it in an envelope, and put it in a safety deposit box. He gave Tracy the key and the location of the bank. He said this was his insurance policy. If anything happened to him, if the dangerous people he feared actually did come after him, the truth would eventually emerge. But he left it to Tracy to decide whether to retrieve that confession and what to do with it. This gesture felt hollow to Tracy. It was yet another way for Nick to appear noble while actually placing the burden of decision on someone else. If she retrieved the confession and turned it over to authorities, she would be the one actively sending him to prison. If she didn't, she would be the one actively concealing evidence of murder. As dawn began to break outside Nick's apartment windows, Tracy realized she had been there all night. The conversation had gone in circles, covering the same ground multiple times as she asked questions, sought clarifications, and tried to find some way to make sense of the senseless. Nick looked exhausted, hollowed out by the emotional weight of his confession. Tracy felt numb, her capacity for shock and horror temporarily depleted by hours of revelations. She knew she needed to leave, to get space and time to think clearly about what to do next, but leaving felt like making a decision. Would she go to the police, or would she go home and try to carry on as if this conversation had never happened? Before Tracy left, Nick made one final plea. He asked her to remember that despite what he had done, he was still her brother. Still the person who had loved her throughout their lives. Still someone capable of remorse and change. He suggested that turning him in wouldn't bring their parents back, but would only add to the family's tragedy by destroying him too. Tracy found this argument both manipulative and somewhat valid. It was true that criminal justice wouldn't resurrect her parents, and it was true that losing Nick to prison would be another profound loss. But wasn't justice important for its own sake? Didn't their parents deserve to have the truth told and their murderer held accountable? Tracy walked out of Nick's apartment building into the cool morning air, feeling like she had aged years in a single night. Everything looked the same streets, the same buildings, the same people beginning their daily routines, but her inner world had been completely transformed. She sat in her car for a long time, unable to start the engine, unable to decide where to go or what to do. The weight of the secret pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had become complicit simply by knowing, simply by not immediately calling the police. Every minute that passed without reporting what she knew felt like another small betrayal of her parents. In the days that followed, Tracy found herself unable to function normally. She called in sick to work, unable to imagine making small talk with colleagues or focusing on mundane professional tasks while carrying such a burden. She avoided friends who might notice something was wrong and asked questions she couldn't answer. She barely ate, barely slept, spending hours staring at the ceiling or pacing her apartment as she tried to work through the impossible decision before her. She looked up the penalties for accessory after the fact, wondering if her delay in reporting Nick's confession had already made her guilty of a crime. The legal and ethical implications tangled together in her mind until she couldn't separate them. Tracy considered seeking guidance from various sources, a lawyer, a therapist, a religious leader, but each option presented problems. A lawyer would likely tell her she was obligated to report the crime, removing the decision from her hands. A therapist might be bound by mandated reporter laws, depending on the jurisdiction. A religious leader might offer moral guidance, but could she trust that advice when it involved such high stakes? She felt isolated and alone, unable to reach out for help without potentially triggering consequences she wasn't ready to face. The financial aspect of the situation also weighed on Tracy's conscience. She had used some of the insurance money to pay off her student loans and make a down payment on a condo. That money had come directly from her parents' deaths that Nick had caused intentionally to collect that very money. Did using those funds make her complicit in some way? Should she give the money to charity or return it to the insurance company if Nick's crime was exposed? These questions added another layer of guilt and confusion to an already overwhelming situation. Tracy also grappled with fear for her own safety. If Nick had been willing to kill their parents to solve his problems, what would stop him from harming her if she became a threat to his freedom? She had always believed she knew Nick's character, but that belief had been shattered by his confession. If she had been so wrong about his capacity for violence before, how could she be certain she was safe now? And what about the dangerous people Nick claimed were asking questions? Were they a real threat or a manipulation tactic? Tracy found herself looking over her shoulder, double-checking her door locks, and jumping at unexpected sounds. As weeks passed, Tracy noticed Nick trying to contact her through texts and phone calls. She ignored most of them, not ready to face him again, not knowing what she would say. But his messages revealed his own deteriorating mental state. He apologized repeatedly, expressed his love for her, and sometimes descended into paranoid rants about being watched or followed. Tracy couldn't tell if his paranoia was justified or if the guilt was driving him toward a psychological breakdown. Either way, it added urgency to her decision. Whatever she chose to do, she needed to do it before Nick's situation deteriorated further. Tracy also had to confront her own grief, which had been complicated exponentially by Nick's confession. She had mourned her parents 3 years ago, or so she thought, but now she had to mourn them all over again with the added horror of knowing how and why they had really died. The anger she felt toward Nick mixed with her grief in toxic ways, sometimes making her physically ill. She would remember happy moments with her parents, and then immediately remember that Nick had stolen their future, had deprived them of retirement, grandchildren, and all the experiences they should have had. The rage this generated was almost unbearable. One evening, Tracy drove to the cemetery where her parents were buried. She stood at their grave, looking at the headstone that bore their names and the dates of their births and deaths. The stone didn't mention that they had been murdered by their own son. It didn't tell the truth of their final moments or the betrayal they had experienced. Tracy found herself talking to them, asking what they would want her to do, begging for some sign or guidance. Of course, no answer came. The dead keep their silence, leaving the living to wrestle with impossible decisions alone. Tracy began researching similar cases, looking for precedents that might guide her thinking. She found stories of family members who had turned in relatives for crimes, facing social ostracism and emotional torment for breaking the family code of silence. She found other stories of people who had kept secrets and later regretted it, carrying guilt for the rest of their lives. Neither path seemed to lead anywhere good. She was damned if she did and damned if she didn't, forced to choose between betraying her brother or betraying her parents' memory. The question of justice became central to Tracy's deliberation. What did her parents deserve? They had been good people, flawed certainly, but loving and decent. They had raised their children, worked hard, paid their taxes, and treated others with kindness. Their lives had value and meaning. Didn't they deserve to have their true story told? Didn't the world deserve to know that their deaths weren't an accident but a crime? On the other hand, would prosecuting Nick serve any real purpose beyond satisfying an abstract concept of justice? He was already suffering, already punishing himself in ways that might be more severe than any court could impose. Was adding legal punishment to psychological torment truly just, or was it simply revenge? Tracy also considered the impact on Nick's future. He was still relatively young, with potentially decades of life ahead of him. If she turned him in, those decades would be spent in prison, his potential contributions to society nullified, his life essentially over. If she stayed silent, he might be able to rebuild, perhaps channel his guilt into positive action, maybe even do good in the world that could partially offset the evil he had committed. Was it her place to make that determination? Did she have the right to play judge, jury, and executioner with his fate? The moral philosophy underlying these questions tortured Tracy. Was justice about punishment, rehabilitation, deterrence, or simply acknowledging truth? Different ethical frameworks gave different answers. A utilitarian might calculate whether more good would come from Nick's imprisonment or from allowing him to potentially contribute positively to society. A deontologist might argue that moral rules against murder demand enforcement regardless of consequences. A virtue ethicist might focus on what choice would make Tracy herself a more virtuous person. None of these frameworks provided clear, unambiguous guidance for her specific situation. Tracy found herself spiraling into darker thoughts. She wondered if she could somehow arrange for Nick to face justice without her active involvement, anonymously tip off police, plant evidence that would lead them to investigate more carefully, create circumstances where the truth would emerge without her direct role. But these scenarios struck her as cowardly and dishonest, attempts to achieve an outcome while avoiding responsibility for choosing it. If she believed Nick should face justice, shouldn't she have the courage to openly make that happen? And if she believed he shouldn't she have the courage to consciously choose mercy? The isolation of carrying this secret became one of the most difficult aspects of Tracy's ordeal. Human beings are social creatures who need to process difficult experiences through communication and connection. But Tracy couldn't share her burden with anyone without potentially triggering consequences she wasn't ready to accept. She became withdrawn, her relationships suffering as she pulled away from friends and colleagues. Some worried about her, noticing the change but not understanding its cause. Their concern and attempts to help only made her feel more isolated because she couldn't explain what was really wrong. Tracy also had to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. She discovered that she had more capacity for moral ambiguity than she had previously believed. Before this crisis, she would have said without hesitation that anyone who committed murder should face justice, that family loyalty couldn't excuse covering up such crimes. But now, faced with the actual choice rather than the hypothetical, she found herself hesitating, rationalizing, finding gray areas where she had previously seen only black and white. This realization was humbling and disturbing. She wasn't the person she had thought she was, and she couldn't predict with certainty what she would ultimately decide to do. The passage of time became both friend and enemy. With each day that passed, Tracy had more time to think through the implications of her choice, but she also moved further from the immediacy of Nick's confession. The sharp edges of her shock and horror began to dull slightly, which seemed wrong. Shouldn't she maintain that clarity of outrage? But human psychology doesn't work that way. We adapt even to horror, gradually incorporating it into our normal framework of experience. Tracy worried that this adaptation would lead her to make a choice based on emotional exhaustion rather than moral clarity. Nick's attempts to contact Tracy became more desperate. He sent messages saying he understood if she hated him, that he deserved whatever she decided to do, but that he needed to know whether she was safe and okay. These messages created additional complexity. They showed that Nick still cared about her well-being, that his capacity for human connection hadn't been entirely destroyed by what he had done. Tracy wanted to dismiss him as a monster, but monsters don't send worried texts checking on their siblings' welfare. The stubborn humanity that Nick retained made her decision harder, not easier. Eventually, Tracy decided she needed to speak with Nick again. She couldn't make this decision in isolation. She needed to look him in the eye and ask more questions, probe deeper into his current state of mind and his plans for the future. They met at a neutral location, a quiet park where they could talk without being overheard. Nick looked even worse than the last time she had seen him. He had lost weight, his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and the shadows under his eyes had deepened into bruises. Whatever punishment Tracy might impose by turning him in would be added to the punishment he was already inflicting on himself. During this second conversation, Tracy asked Nick the questions that had been haunting her. If he could go back in time, would he make a different choice? Nick said yes without hesitation, that he would rather have faced whatever consequences his gambling debts brought than live with what he had done. Tracy asked if he had considered turning himself in. Nick admitted he had thought about it constantly, but felt paralyzed by fear. Fear of prison, fear of the judicial process, fear of his crime becoming public and bringing shame on the family name. Tracy pointed out that his fear of consequences was what had led to the crime in the first place, that he seemed to be repeating the same pattern of avoiding accountability. Nick acknowledged this was true, but seemed unable to break the cycle on his own. Tracy asked Nick about the practical aspects of his life now. Was he still gambling? Nick said no, that he hadn't placed a bet since the fire, that the addiction had been broken by the horror of what it had led him to do. Was he in therapy? Nick admitted he had tried, but couldn't be honest with a therapist about the real source of his guilt, making the sessions pointless. Did he have friends, connections, a support system? Nick shook his head. He had isolated himself, unable to maintain relationships while carrying such a secret, unable to trust that his mask wouldn't slip and reveal the truth. Tracy realized that in some ways, Nick was already serving a life sentence, just not in a formal prison. Tracy also asked about the dangerous people Nick had mentioned in his first confession. Were they still a threat? Nick said he wasn't sure, that the paranoia made it hard to distinguish real threats from imagined ones. He admitted that some of what he had told her might have been exaggerated, a manifestation of guilt-induced anxiety rather than actual danger. This admission made Tracy wonder what else in Nick's confession might have been distorted by his psychological state. Could she trust anything he had told her? Was his remorse genuine, or was it a performance designed to manipulate her sympathy? The uncertainty was maddening. As their conversation continued, Tracy found herself asking the question that had been at the heart of her turmoil. What do you want me to do? Nick was quiet for a long time before answering. Finally, he said that he wanted her to do whatever would allow her to live with herself, whatever would bring her peace. If that meant turning him in, he would accept it. If it meant keeping the secret, he would be grateful but wouldn't expect her to bear that burden for his sake. The answer felt both honest and evasive. Honest because Nick seemed to genuinely mean it, evasive because it still placed the ultimate responsibility on Tracy's shoulders. Tracy realized that perhaps there was no right answer to her dilemma, no choice that would feel completely justified and leave her without regrets. Both paths forward carried profound moral weight and personal cost. Whichever direction she chose, she would have to live with the consequences for the rest of her life, wondering if she had made the correct decision or if the road not taken would have been better. This was the burden of moral agency in its rawest form. The recognition that our choices matter, that they shape not only our own lives but the lives of others, and that we can never know with certainty whether we chose wisely. In the end, Tracy's decision would define not just what happened to Nick, but who she herself would become. Would she be a person who valued justice above family loyalty, or vice versa? Would she be someone who could live with keeping a terrible secret, or someone who needed to speak truth regardless of consequences? There was no way to make this choice without revealing something fundamental about her own character and values. The process of deciding was forcing Tracy to confront the deepest questions of identity and morality that most people have the luxury of avoiding. As Tracy left the park that day, she still hadn't told Nick what she had decided. Maybe she still didn't know herself. The weight of the choice pressed down on her with unrelenting force, and she knew that whatever path she chose, part of her would forever wonder about the other possibility. This is the nature of profound moral dilemmas. They don't offer clean solutions or easy answers, only difficult choices and lasting uncertainty. The story of Tracy Reiner and her brother Nick is ultimately a story about the limits of family loyalty, the complexity of justice, and the burden of secrets that are too heavy for one person to carry. It's about discovering that the people we think we know best can surprise us in the most terrible ways, and about finding that our own moral certainties dissolve when tested by real-world complexity. Tracy's ordeal reminds us that truth can be devastating, that knowledge can be a curse, and that sometimes there are no good options, only the necessity of choosing between various shades of wrong. Whatever Tracy ultimately decided, her life had been irrevocably changed by Nick's confession. The innocence of not knowing could never be restored. The comfortable certainties of family trust could never be rebuilt. She would carry this knowledge and its weight for the rest of her life, and every day she would have to reconcile her choice with her conscience. That ongoing reconciliation, that daily reckoning with the choice she made, might be the heaviest burden of all.